This is the speech I was asked to give to the subcommittee of the Georgia Senate about Confederate monuments, and subsequently I was not allowed to deliver. I come to you today to express my unconditional support, both as a scholar of the South and the Civil War, and as a resident of the state of Georgia, of Senator Parent's SB 51, which gives power back to local governments to make their own decisions regarding Confederate monuments. Tabling the fact that SB 51 should be supported by every self described conservative in the legislature, as it limits the reaches of big government and restores autonomy to the people of a town or city. It is certainly a bill that we, as Georgians, desperately need so that we can begin working on repairing and healing our nation's long history of racism and white supremacy. I want to spend my time today giving you a brief history of our state and explain the historical context in which these Confederate monuments were erected and dedicated, because I suspect that the real history of these monuments might surprise you. Senators, let's be honest. It's been a while since any of us were students. Combine that with the fact that history textbooks are politically motivated and lag behind actual historical scholarship by decades. There is somewhere close to 40 to 60 years, now let that sink in, 40 to 60 years of new work on slavery, the Civil War, and the legacies of racism and Jim Crow that the general American adult, no matter how well educated, simply does not know. So I am here today to give you a short rundown of what is now accepted canon among professionally trained historians. The Confederacy, created solely to serve the interests of the slave regime of the Old South, needs to be historicized as such. For African Americans, the Confederacy represents hundreds of years of terror, rape, brutalization, and enslavement. Its monuments function as a constant reminder of an extremely painful past. And, as you will soon hear, the monuments would also function as a tool of terrorism, erected during some of the bloodiest years of Jim Crow as a way to remind Black Georgians of their place at the bottom of society. To be sure, Confederate monuments' ubiquitousness in front of nearly every local courthouse in the state is brimming with symbolism. Not only did they, and do they, function as a reminder of Georgia's long history of white supremacy, they were placed at the courthouses specifically to remind Black voters of this fact. Yet I'd like to remind you, senators, that even for a sizable percentage of white Southerners, known as poor whites, these are people who in the antebellum era owned neither land nor slaves, and who I estimate in my book to comprise at least 1/3 of Georgia's white population. Slavery itself was deeply harmful. It spurred forces that drove down their wages, took their jobs, pushed them off the land, denied them civil rights, and kept them languishing in cycles of poverty. The Confederacy sought to perpetuate their impoverishment. Confederate monuments represent nothing more than a fiction, an uncomplicated fantasy in which all whites proudly and bravely fought for the South, a South that is reimagined without the attendant horrors of slavery. The truth, though, the truth is wholly different. Historians now know that most poor whites, as well as many non-slaveholding yeoman farmers, mostly residing outside of the Cotton Black Belt in the southern piney woods areas and the foothills and mountains of Appalachia, they were not in favor of secession and were certainly not excited to fight for the Confederacy. These men had no desire to fight and die to protect the slave wealth of about 1/3 of Georgia's white families. Many of them were Unionists, and many more were apathetic anti-Confederates who simply wanted to be left alone without the government interfering in their lives. But the Confederacy would not allow that, conscripting non-slaveholders to fight while simultaneously exempting from service the largest, wealthiest slaveholders, threatening small farmers with arrest, and lynching poor men who would not join up. The South's slaveholders lorded over a deeply divided region, a region in which insurrections by both Black and white Southerners, like the one we saw in the popular movie, The Free State of Jones, were much more common than you may realize. It's actually ironic because it was precisely areas with low slaveholding rates, areas like Senator Mullis's district in northwest Georgia, where white unionism and anti Confederate sentiment helped topple the Confederacy. Parts of your district, Senator Mullis, were actually populated by white men in open rebellion against the Confederacy. We all know the old saying that the Civil War was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. And that maxim is absolutely true for the Deep South, especially Georgia. The Confederacy suffered excruciatingly high desertion rates as men who had no stake in slavery abandoned the long, bloody war and returned home to their families. With the defection and desertion of tens of thousands of non slaveholders and tens of thousands of enslaved people escaping to Union lines and thus freedom, the Confederacy was finally defeated. Now, for almost 30 years after the Civil War, there was no major movement to honor the Confederate dead. Yet things all changed in the 1890s with the rise of Big P populism. The movement was comprised by non-affluent farmers and working men, both black and white, banding together to demand more from a government that continually privileged the rich and often ruined the lives of ordinary, hardworking Americans who wanted nothing more than to earn a decent living. Populism in Georgia flourished, especially between 1892 and 1896, reaching its high point in 1894, the precise year that the United Daughters of the Confederacy, or UDC, was formed. The United Daughters of the Confederacy was comprised of the most affluent Southern white women who were determined to use Confederate symbols and flags to educate white children in the supposed glories and traditions of the old slave South. The vast majority of Confederate monuments in the South were funded and sponsored by the UDC between the years of 1894 and 1919. Now, if you know anything about Southern history, you will realize that this is the precise time of the worst lynchings in Southern history, one of the bloodiest and most vicious parts of Jim Crow. These years are essentially a reign of terror for Black people in the Deep South. The great migration of Black Southerners to northern cities happens then, as white Southerners concoct and propagandize the idea of the solid white South Confederate lost cause, as white Southerners burned, destroyed, and looted African American businesses and killed, arrested, and lynched Black men, women, and children with impunity. Let's all keep in mind that many of the Confederate monuments in the metro Atlanta area were erected in the wake of the Atlanta race riot of 1906, in which whites destroyed the business district of Black Atlanta, killing dozens, if not scores, of African American residents. There's much more I could say, but in the interest of time, I'd like to end with this. The most terrible thing about the war, I am convinced, is its monuments, concluded the famous scholar and one-time Atlanta resident W.E.B. Du Bois. Of course, the plain truth of the matter would be an inscription something like this: sacred to the memory of those who fought to perpetuate human slavery. In the name of what is right and good and moral about this city and country, please allow localities to remove these painful reminders of the worst of our history. Allow us to take down these daily remembrances of violence, white supremacy, and hate, these memorials to traitors of the United States of America. Given all the viciousness, violence, and oppression associated with the Confederacy, it is thus more important than ever to support legislation like SB 51. Please allow the citizens of this state to govern ourselves. Allow us to remove these horrific memorials that laud the ownership of human beings, memorials that rest upon a land soaked with the sweat of unfree, brutalized, enslaved labor, and stained by the blood of untold thousands. Allow us to take down these monuments to racist cruelty and division and hate, and perhaps we may finally begin to come together and heal.